Greetings to our viewers. We are here to discuss the findings of a significant research project that has taken place over the past year and is now more or less concluded. In this research, we dedicate our attention to an issue that has impacted the lives of many people across the globe, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. But here, we focus particularly on church attendance among Catholic and Protestant communities in Malaysia and Singapore as a result of the pandemic. Over the next hour or so, we'll be delving deeply into the findings of a significant research initiative that illuminates not only possibly shifting patterns of worship, but also the social and spiritual resilience of Christian communities in the face of extraordinary disruption. Let me begin with a brief introduction to CHRISTE, the Christian Institute for Theological Engagement. CHRISTE is a collaborative hub for Christian scholars of various disciplines dedicated to advancing theological reflection within the contemporary world. CHRISTE was established to encourage a flourishing of Christian thought that is rooted in both rigorous academic research and the lived experience of faith, especially within diverse and multi-religious contexts. At its core, CHRISTE serves as a platform where the worlds of faith and scholarship meet. We aim to help Christian leaders and the Christian public to be more analytical and discerning in their understanding of matters pertaining to faith and society, offering thoughtful Christian responses to the events and trends shaping our societies today. It's my pleasure to introduce two of my distinguished friends who have played central roles in this research project. I begin with Dr. Pauline Leong, who is Associate Professor and Head of the School of Communication and Media Studies at Sunway University, Malaysia. She has published extensively on topics such as media, politics, and digital communication in Malaysia. Joining us as well is Dr. Tan Meng Yeoh. Meng Yeoh is Senior Lecturer in Media and Communication Studies and also Deputy Head of School at the School of Arts and Social Sciences in Monash University, Malaysia. His research focus is on the intersection of religion and new media, particularly how internet practices shape religious communication. We should certainly mention also that collaborating in the background is our friend, Dr. Lim Hock An, who is Senior Lecturer and the Director of Quality Assurance at Infrastructure University Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Together, these researchers have collaborated on a study that doesn't merely tally numbers, but seeks to grasp the complex realities faced by churchgoers and leaders in Malaysia and Singapore. How did congregations respond to restrictions on physical gatherings? And crucially, how has the legacy of the pandemic continued to shape attendance patterns, even as societies reopen? I'm delighted to welcome our panel of scholars who are involved in this research project. So Pauline and Meng Yeoh are with me today. Their work invites us to reflect on a pivotal chapter in our region's religious history, one that is still unfolding and in which stories of loss, adaptation, and hope are deeply intertwined. So let's begin our conversation.
Yes. Thank you, Deacon Chairman, for your introduction and kind words. Our research brings us back to the dark days of the pandemic where the world was almost brought to a standstill. During that time, as you can see from the picture, everyone had to stay at home to avoid spreading the virus, which had at that time caused massive fatalities because there were no vaccines that could stop it. Following international protocols, the Malaysian government then implemented strict quarantine and movement control order. The first lockdown was on 18 March 2020 and went through multiple phases and iterations until the end of 2021 and early 2022. The early lockdown, right, was in March to June 2020, and it was the strictest. Only very few people could go in and out, and religious gatherings especially was not allowed as they would involve mass people congregating, which would contribute to the spread of the virus. So first, for the first time in Malaysian history, churches across Malaysia were closed during this period. Religious leaders then had to scramble to find alternative ways to reach their flock. The most obvious was the adoption of online platforms as a means to preach, but this was not something which churches were familiar with. Suddenly, priests and pastors had to pivot to use digital technology. unlike in the past, where they relied on face-to-face interpersonal interactions and communication by preaching from the pulpit during Sunday Mass and worship. Church-going Christians also felt a sense of loss during this period as they could not physically go to church as part of their weekly worship. There was a sense of isolation and loss of community as they tried to make sense of their faith amidst the chaos of the pandemic. This is where our research comes in. When the situation improves slightly, churches were allowed to admit a restricted number of congregants with strict SOPs. Slowly, as the situation improved, more and more people were allowed to return to celebrating Mass and worship physically in church. So this begs the question, have we lost some sheep along the way? Has the closure of churches during the COVID-19 pandemic affected the faith of Christians? Has the transition to online Mass and worship changed the way Christians think about what is church? Hence, we have these research objectives, which are, what are the motivations behind Malaysian and Singaporean Christians' decision to return or not to return to the physical church after the lockdown restrictions were lifted? What are the aspects of the online church that worked and what did not? How can authentic spirituality be experienced in the online church context? I will now pass this over to my colleague, Dr. Tan Meng Yo, who will now talk about the online digital religion in relation to the Christian faith.
Thanks, Pauline, and thanks for the opportunity to share in this presentation. So what I'm going to do now is just to give a little bit of background on the subject of online or digital religion a bit more broadly so that we can ground our findings later in, contextually, right, in this field of study. So just a bit of background knowledge. When we talk about online and digital religion, this is a field of study that's actually been around for some time, since the emergence of the internet, really. And during the time of COVID-19, it became a very mainstream research area because suddenly it's something that most religious people participated in or exposed to in some form. But it actually, when we think about what exactly do we mean with digital religion, it actually takes many different forms. So what you see on the screen in the early days when people talked about online religion or digital religion, I'm using those terms interchangeably here, we're really talking about websites. People go onto websites to look for information. So that's a form of digital religion. So if I am interested in something, I want to know a little bit more, I could go online and search for some information about the Bible, for example. Now, as the internet progressed with new functionalities and new practices, a significant attention was paid to not just what people put on websites, whether it's institutional or individual. People started paying attention to how social media was used, how were individual expressions of spirituality or religiosity put online. So we see blogs, social media, a lot of different content, a lot of different kinds of communities emerging where people talk about religion. You have interreligious dialogue, coming to the fore in these spaces as well. Then I suppose in the COVID-19 context, we are looking more in this third category, which is recordings and live streaming. So people are attending churches online. And well, we're not really talking about the last circle, but just to prompt you a little bit, if you're interested in this area, there's a lot of discussion about church or religious experience in the VR space, the metaverse, mixed realities, and of course, AI, chatbots, and games. And these are areas where religious or spiritual activities may take place, right? So another area of research. But yeah, so it takes on many forms. And although I've just presented it like a linear progression of time, we just want to keep in mind that all these practices they overlap and happen at the same time. People still do attend social media, attend churches online, go on social media, go on websites. They do many different things at different capacities. Maybe slide. The next slide. So those are the contexts in which online religion happens. Now, this slide really just to ground all of us in some theory. These are the what I consider the 5 areas that people discuss academically about what online religion means, common discussion points. What are some of the debates? What are some of the curiosities that we have about it? So these are the 5 main areas. But we're really, well, I'm most interested in authenticity because it underpins all the others. So the question people ask is, for example, authenticity is what can online religious experiences be considered real religious experiences? All right. If I participate in an online service, does it count? Even if an extreme example I can think of, if someone is water baptized in the metaverse, is that an authentic baptism? We don't have to answer that now. I'm just giving you examples. Then people talk about spirituality, spiritual transactions. That's a term I like to use. Do spiritual transactions take place on the internet? Can praying for someone over chat, is that a spiritual act? Can I worship authentically? The third one, which is a major area of debate, is who has authority when it comes to religious matters online. Does the institution still maintain a strong influence over religious matters, or do we see the emergence of individual interpretations of what any particular religion should be? And of course, community and identity are issues that are not just limited to Christian or religious discussions, but to anyone using the internet. Are communities, what's the nature of communities online? And how does engaging with this space impact our identity, or what does it say about who we are? So these are common areas of discussion put together about the field of digital religion or online religion. But just to zoom in a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, I find the subject of authenticity perhaps the most pressing, because you can use the question of authenticity on everything else, on authority, on spirituality and community and identity. And when we say authentic, what do we really mean? What's the criteria for authentic, right? So, I mean, I've got some references here, different interpretation, perception of any combination of attributes such as authority, fidelity, origin, credibility, sincerity, historical accuracy, or materiality, not written here, right? And the second one, another description is religion is authentically religious when it fulfills God's divinely ordained purposes, which means that it may be less rooted in technical criteria, but is based on what one considers to be God's purpose being fulfilled, whatever that may be. And an example I always like to throw out there is talking about food, right? People like to throw the word authentic, nasi lemak, authentic char kway teow, as if that makes it better just by labeling it as such. So we want to be very careful about what authentic means. Is it just that, just because it comes from an original place, it must always come from that one original place? Or is that tied to an experience? Maybe this version of noodles or nasi lemak creates that experience that's meant to be experienced. So we just want to think of this a little bit more broadly for today's discussion. So basically the tension is between two different interpretations of authentic. Is it an experiential approach? Because I felt a spiritual impact when I attended an online service, therefore it must be authentic. So this is a very audience-centric approach. In my previous talks, I've talked about these things. If a life is transformed through an activity online, surely something authentic must have happened. All right, but that's an audience-centric point of view. And through our discussion today, we want to pay attention to we want to pay attention to the online and the offline. So this is the second thing I want to leave with this section. So in measuring authenticity, we're not just measuring what goes on online, but we're also looking at how people experience their faith online and whether these two areas come together or not. So merely seeing what is online is insufficient in the broader analysis of online religion, but it's necessary to consider the broader context in which the online appears and function. So we want to look at both, all right? Looking at what happens online alone, never quite enough, okay, when we're talking about online religion. Yeah. Yeah. So just leave you with this quote for this section. Why do some religious actors judge certain performances or traditions as authentic, and why do others not? How do they legitimize these judgments? Are there differences between individual religious actors and the official institutions regarding argumentation, and what is classified as authentic or fake, and which forms of argumentation are convincing and for whom? So with this in mind, I hope as we go through the findings, I mean, we're gonna give you some conclusions and all that, but the question to think about is, why do people prefer, for example, why do people prefer attending church online? What exactly is the experience? Is it authentic? Is it valid? How do we find out more about whether it's authentic or valid or not? Why do people insist on going back to church once lockdowns happen? What is it about a sense of community? Is it about a sense of materiality? What's authentic about those experiences? So we just have this at the back of our minds as we go through the findings, and I hope that this becomes a bit of a richer experience for everyone. So I think with that, I'm going to pass the time back to Pauline. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much, Mingyu, for sharing your thoughts. Basically, I'm now covering the research method as well as part of the findings. We use a mixed method approach to for this study, where we conducted an online survey as well as semi-structured interviews with Malaysians and Singaporeans. The survey had 518 respondents, both from Malaysia and Singapore, and the questionnaire was tested using a Chromebook Alpha test and was found to be reliable. However, for the purposes of this presentation, we are focusing only on the findings from the survey, as we are still processing data from the interviews. Participants were asked about their church experience, right? Pre, during, and post lockdown, as well as their views on the community and technology and spirituality. So this is mainly exploratory. It's a very diverse representation, and of course, all participants were anonymized in this presentation. Okay, so our findings found that a majority of the 2/3 of them were female and mostly above 40 with a university education. More than half are Catholics, 60%, while a number of them were actually long-term Christians for more than 20 years. What we found in the data was that the comparison between pre-post, during, and post-pandemic behavior, there were no significant differences between Malaysians and Singaporeans. It shows how close we are, right? And in terms of gender as well, there was no significant differences between male and female. So the data was presented for both, right? Yeah, and we move on to this. So the data showed that those who consistently attended mass or service prior to the pandemic were also consistent during the pandemic. And subsequently, those who are consistently attending mass or service during the pandemic were also consistent post-pandemic, right? So if you're consistent before, during, after, you're also consistent. However, right, those who attended mass irregularly or mass and service irregularly before the pandemic stopped attending mass or service post-pandemic. Right. Next was age. We found that the older Christians attended, more of them attended online mass or service during the pandemic compared to the younger Christians, those that were between 18 to 20. And the Protestants attended their own online church services, right? Mostly of them. But compared to Catholics who, I guess, went church hopping, they attended online mass from other churches. However, those who didn't attend online mass or service during the pandemic, they felt that, well, it did not mean anything to them. It was not meaningful, and it did not fulfill their spiritual needs. And sadly, they felt that they felt no longer close to God. Right. However, because of that, they rather prefer attending mass or service physically in church because of the spiritual fulfillment. They needed the physical space to pray together as a community and they found that the atmosphere in a physical church was more spiritual compared to online. However, those who attended mass online felt strongly satisfied with the experience. The reason was that they felt that it was more convenient and they liked the fact that they had options. And some said that this helped that helped into the spiritual satisfaction. Next, we also found that Malaysian Christians were quite ambivalent or perhaps neutral towards online mass or service compared to Singaporeans who were quite satisfied with attending online digital church. Right. Next, we also found that those who did not attend online mass or service, they had a view. They felt that even though they did not attend online mass or service during the pandemic, they felt that Christians should have a choice on whether they want to attend mass or service online or physically in church post-pandemic. Right. Those, however, who attended mass online during the pandemic felt that church leaders should encourage the flock to return physically to church post-pandemic. Okay. Lastly, we also found that Protestants were a bit more flexible in terms of the digital church. They were significantly high. They had significantly high agreement that Christians should have a choice whether they should attend mass or service online or physically in church. They also felt that online mass or service in online mass or service could achieve spiritual growth, and it was sufficient for them. Next, we will move on to Dr. Tan, who will then talk about the analysis of these findings.
Right. Thanks, Dr. Pauline. So just to summarize some of the findings, to put it into a few big picture analysis. So the first thing we can observe from all the findings is, generally speaking, there was a willingness to participate in online services, given the context of the pandemic. Related to that, even though they were mostly online during the lockdowns, the eagerness to return to physical church was always high. So the anticipation was always there. Right? So this suggests that online services served as a crucial but temporary means for Christians in both Malaysia and Singapore to continue participating and observing some form of religious ritual, to continue to engage with the church community, to continue with the practices, and with the intention of coming back to the services in physical form once it's allowed. Just as a slight point of interest, to go sideways a little bit, one thing we've observed is that interest in online services was not the same, not in terms of country, but in terms of age. We found that the younger demographic participated less during the lockdowns. And I put that this is consistent with previous findings because in an earlier project that I did the year prior, where I spoke to church leaders, this was something that they reflected on as well. They noticed that from the institution's perspective, they've also noticed that the young people are less likely to stay on and persist with the online services. So I'm just throwing it out there as a point of interest because it's fascinating. Thinking that the younger generation, which would more likely be tech savvy, were less likely to stay on, whereas the older folks were more eager to learn the technology and stay engaged. So it's a point of curiosity that I'm sincerely hoping one day we can find out a little bit more about. So I'm just putting it out there because it's come up twice already. To go on. So the motivations. So I said earlier that there was an eagerness to come back to church. So why is that? The motivations can largely be brought down, summarized to two main points. One is spiritual fulfillment, going back to what we talk about authenticity. There's something authentic about going to church, being in the place and getting and experiencing God through worship in a physical congregation. And related to that is, of course, a sense of community, making friends online, engaging with your usual church community is more fulfilling when you get to see them, touch, go out, hang out. But overall, generally speaking, there were very minimal differences between the Catholic respondents and Protestant responses, as well as the Malaysian and Singaporeans. You have some variation here and there, mainly in the area of flexibility about whether one can or should continue in online services. After the lockdowns, there were a larger group of participants from the Protestant respondents who were willing to stay online. But beyond that, the responses were quite consistent and similar. So with this in mind, I just want to conclude with a couple of points. And the conclusion is always opportunity for us to ask new questions. So what can we take away from all of this? So the lockdowns and emergence of online services did not necessarily alter the underlying habits of Christians in Malaysia and Singapore. Instead, the online habits served as an extension of what was already in practice pre-COVID. Basically, what we're saying is if you were already not going to church before COVID, it's unlikely you pick up an online service during the lockdowns and go back to church after. You are not going to create a new habit during the lockdown. At least that's where the evidence points to it. If you were already a regular churchgoer, engaged with the community and so on and so forth, it's more likely that you will find a way to continue with that practice through that online lockdown phase and with the eagerness to go back to what was pre-COVID. Yeah, and this is quite an important point. As I mentioned earlier, the online and the offline are quite more closely related than we think. So to move on from there, theoretically, the online engagement and eagerness to return to the physical church is tied to experience of, authenticity, authentic spiritual experiences, authentic worship, even authentic community. So future exploration of these themes, along with discussion on technological affordances and material religion, is crucial. What's so special about this material space that we call church or community? But I want to end on this note, just on what I said earlier about how the online and offline are more closely related than we think. It's quite easy for us to take today's findings or ask the question about whether the online or the offline, which version of church experience is better or worse. Yeah, that's partly what we're showing with our results here. But the whole thing about habits that persist, whether it's online or offline, actually leads me to a different point of reflection. We can sidestep the binary for a little bit. It's not so much about which one is better, which one is worse, but what does the technology say about who we are? What does the technology reveal about you? And what does it reveal about me? When we talk about internet studies broadly, one of the arguments they make is people go online to do the same thing more. It expresses something more about them. So if you're already not going to church, the technology reveals to you that you're not going to church. If you're not interested, it reveals to you that you're not interested. If you're already doing something, the internet reveals to you the many, many different ways you can do more of the same thing. So what does that say about who we are? So it's just a good point for reflection, not just for academic research purposes, but for our personal everyday practices as well. So on that note, I conclude this presentation and pass the time over to Dr. Sherman.
Thank you so much, Pauline and Meng Yo. I think these efforts that we have put in together has revealed something really intriguing for the entire Christian community in Malaysia and Singapore. Those who come from both Catholic as well as Protestant traditions. Essentially, I think we are not so much talking just about faith or religious practice per se. We are talking about human behavior, very much so. I think the main point that we have derived from this finding is technology as a mirror of human religious behavior. And there is, I think, a lot that can be said about this. So I just want to share some reflections from a theological, perhaps a little bit of a sociological, anthropological perspective on these findings. Of course, there is much that can be said, but these are some what we may call preliminary reflections on the findings, which I think are very important. They are very significant, and I hope that we have at least some church leaders from our various Christian traditions that take note of these findings. So I have some points to share here. Firstly, some introductory comments. This research offers not only quantitative insights, but also a qualitative window into the contemporary religious life of Christians within our post-pandemic landscape. I note that the results highlight two primary observations. First, that irregular church attendees before pandemic remain unlikely to resume consistent attendance afterwards. And second, that those who embrace online worship during lockdowns were largely the same individuals already committed to regular attendance in pre-pandemic times. This, at first glance, may seem predictable, but on deeper reflection, it calls forth important theological, philosophical, and ecclesiological considerations. The pandemic was a unique, globally shared experience of disruption. It forced churches into a sudden recalibration of how worship, fellowship, and community life could be sustained in the absence of physical gatherings. Some commentators in both ecclesial and academic circles speculated that such a crisis might catalyze a spiritual awakening among the less religiously engaged. But this research shows the opposite. Pre-existing patterns of commitment were largely reinforced rather than overturned, as you have very aptly described. We must therefore approach these findings not as an anecdote about church attendance, but as a mirror reflecting the deeper structure of Christian discipleship and belonging. One of the most striking features of the findings is the continuity they reveal. Those who regularly gathered with fellow Christians before the pandemic were largely those who found ways, whether virtually or by early in-person return, to continue in worship. This points to what theologians and sociologists might describe as a religious habitus or habit, a religious habit. And this is also a term that Ming Yo has mentioned. This is an ingrained set of dispositions, practices, and rhythms that shape a person's daily and weekly life. Here, I make mention of Pierre Bourdieu and his concept of habitus, although often applied in social theory, has theological resonance. Christian habitus is not simply a matter of intellectual conviction or sporadic religious feeling. It is a pattern of life in which regular liturgical participation, prayer, and scripture form are central. This kind of formation is slow, embodied, and reinforced over time, and it becomes a part of one's identity to such a degree that when disruption occurs, one's instinct to preserve the pattern, even if its mode of expression must adapt. Here, Christian anthropology reminds us human beings are not merely thinkers or feelers, but embodied creatures whose loves, desires, and commitments are trained through repeated action. To borrow from James Smith's influential Cultural Liturgies trilogy, we are liturgical animals, he says, shaped more by the practices in which we participate than by abstract beliefs alone. The pandemic tested that formation. Those whose habits were already strong could transpose them into an online setting. Those without such embedded rhythms found it much harder to forge them from scratch. The research implicitly gestures towards a more ancient theological idea, the religious sense of Christians, which in Catholic thought is often linked to the sensus fidelium, that is, the sense of the faithful. This refers to the spirit-enabled instinct of believers to recognize and live in the truth of the gospel. Yet, for this sense to flourish, it generally requires cultivation within the life of the church. For the regular attendee, the longing for corporate worship is sustained by this cultivated spiritual instinct, shaped by sacramental life, scripture, and community. The temporary shift to online worship did not alter the underlying desire, because that desire has deep roots. For the less committed, the religious sense may have remained latent or underdeveloped, making it less likely that absence from physical worship would lead to renewed engagement. From an ecclesiological or church perspective, this aligns with the understanding that faith is both personal and communal. A believer's personal disposition towards God is profoundly nurtured in and through the visible community of the church, which mediates grace through word and sacrament. Where such nurture is weak or irregular, the individual's religious sense is often fragile and vulnerable to erosion under pressure. The pandemic pushed churches across the world to embrace live streaming, pre-recorded services, and digital fellowship. For many, these platforms were indeed a lifeline. They allowed the already committed to maintain some continuity with the worshiping life of their congregation. The discipline of setting aside a time on Sunday to engage virtually, sometimes even dressing as they would for church, singing along with recorded hymns, or sharing in printed liturgies, demonstrated that the form may change, but the desire for God's presence and God's people remains constant for the spiritually formed. Yet the study's findings show that online worship proved far less magnetic or attractive for the disengaged. In part, this may reflect the embodied nature of Christian faith. Christianity is unapologetically incarnational, from the Word becoming flesh to the material realities of bread and wine in the Eucharist. Participation involves bodies, senses, gestures, and presence. Virtual spaces can convey words and music, but cannot fully replicate the sacramental, corporal dimensions of worship. Philosophically, this distinction recalls the Aristotelian and Thomistic understanding that human beings know through the senses and act through embodied engagement. To attend a service online without any prior commitment or lived communal belonging may feel more like watching a performance than entering into a covenantal act of worship. This explains why live stream availability did not inherently generate new commitment among the passively interested. Crises have often served as moments of spiritual re-evaluation, both personally and communally. The early church flourished under persecution. Times of plague in medieval Europe inspired both profound devotion and acts of service. It is perhaps surprising then that the pandemic did not seem to awaken significant new religious impulses among the loosely affiliated. However, the pandemic was not only a health crisis, it was also a crisis of connectedness. The forced isolation removed many of the ambient social reinforcements that encourage religious engagement. For example, casual conversations in church corridors, the cultural momentum of what particular communities usually do on Sundays, and the relational accountability of being missed when absent. In philosophical terms, the pandemic revealed that for some Christians, the ecclesial bond was more sociological than deeply theological. For others, it proved that their identity as worshippers was already sufficiently interiorized to survive, adapt, and even thrive in altered conditions. Seen through the lens of Scripture, such moments can be likened to the testing imagery of 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7. Faith is tested by fire, so that its genuineness may become evident. The pandemic became a form of sifting, exposing the depth or shallowness of spiritual roots. Theologically, the persistence of the committed and the inactivity of the disengaged affirm that faith is both a gift of grace and a discipline of practice. Grace initiates and sustains the believer's faith, but the believer is also called to cooperate with grace through deliberate participation in the means by which God nourishes faith. Over time, spiritual habits form channels for grace to operate more deeply. Regular worship attendance, prayer, and service are not meritorious works in themselves, but participatory responses to God's invitation. In the disruption of the pandemic, those with established channels could still receive grace through them, albeit in altered form, while those with few or broken channels found themselves spiritually isolated. If churches simply interpret the research as proof that the committed stayed committed and the uncommitted stayed uncommitted, they risk missing the pastoral invitations embedded in these findings. The church cannot be content with a static membership core. The mission is outward-looking, evangelical, and hospitable. The findings challenge church leaders to ask, how can we cultivate deeper belonging among those whose faith remains at the margins? How can we create spaces where exploring faith feels relationally inviting rather than religiously intimidating? It may require moving beyond service-centered models to networks of small groups, mentorships, and relational discipleship that incarnate the Christian story in everyday contexts. Furthermore, ministers and lay leaders must reckon with the theological limitations of digital-only engagement. Online outreach can be a useful point of contact, but it should ideally lead people towards embodied participation and the sacramental life of the church. The research underscores the ongoing relevance of the late Pope Francis's call for a culture of encounter. Evangelization in the post-pandemic age cannot simply mean streaming sermons more effectively or efficiently. It must involve creating genuine relationships where questions, doubts, and struggles can be shared without fear of exclusion. For the irregular attendees who did not return, re-engagement might come less from invitations to Sunday services and more from invitations into everyday life by way of shared meals, acts of service, study groups in homes, and partnerships in addressing local needs. Such contexts often lower the relational and psychological barriers to deeper faith involvement. Perhaps the most fitting biblical analogy is Jesus' parable of the sower in Mark chapter 4. For some, the seed fell on good soil before the pandemic, and the crisis only deepened their roots. For others, the soil was shallow or crowded with thorns. When the heat of isolation came, the growth withered. Far from being a cause for judgment, this awareness can inspire renewed cultivation, patiently breaking up the hard ground, removing the thorns of distraction, and planting seeds in hospitable soil. This research provides not merely statistics, but a call to introspection and action. It shows that Christian commitment is resilient when it is rooted in spiritual formation, but fragile when it is only loosely tied to community and worship. The post-pandemic church must therefore deepen its discipleship, strengthen its relational bonds, and recover its confidence in the incarnational nature of its mission. As Hebrews chapter 10 says, or urges, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. This is not only a summons for the already committed, but a mandate to reach out to those still distant, inviting them into the life-giving rhythm of God's people gathered in worship and service. So these are some reflections that I think directly correspond with the findings of your research. So once again, on behalf of CHRISTE and on behalf of the Christian community, I really would like to thank you, Pauline Meng Yo, and also Hop An, who's not able to be here with us today in this recording, for the effort that you have put into this research. I think that the findings are really significant and helpful in our reflection for the way forward after pandemic for our Christian communities. So I really do hope that many Christian leaders will take heed of these findings. And of course, for our research team, this is not the end. I'm sure we are looking forward to other forms of output from these findings, whether they be publications in some journals or even in monographs, books, or also perhaps some presentations in the conference or two. So we will be continuing to work together on this project, but we thought that we would share the findings first before anything else, so that the Christian community, especially the gatekeepers of the Christian communities around our region, can benefit from the research. So thank you very much, and God bless all of you.